Good morning and welcome to the Global Current. I'm Joshua Siegel.
And I'm Elaine Du.
In news, the terrorist bombing in Ankara.
Threats by the South African government to leave the International Criminal Court.
And a Nobel Prize in Economics for research on poverty.
An analysis the effects of Russia's increasing involvement in Syria.
And the rise of far-right political parties in Europe.
Then the Global Current brings you a lecture this week from Seton Hall on governance, reform, and anti-corruption initiative in Indonesia.
Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the show.
And now Emily Livaday reports on a terrorist bombing this week in Turkey's capital.
A terrorist attack in Ankara, Turkey last Saturday killed 97 people. 2 suicide bombers detonated at a pro-Kurdish peace rally. According to Reuters, the attack was the worst in the history of Turkey. On Wednesday, Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu announced both ISIS and the PKK, a pro-Kurdish extremist group, may have played a role in the attack. NPR reports that Turkey's recent establishment of NATO bases has made the nation a target for ISIS attacks. The bombers allegedly used 11 pounds of TNT packed with metal balls. The recent terror attack is the furthest inland that ISIS has struck thus far. The terror attack last week incited public outcry over the apparent lapse in security that allowed such an attack to happen. A Turkish news outlet, Today's Zaman, reports Ankara's second criminal court of peace found that several other embassies were tipped off prior to the bombing, and there was a lapse in government vigilance. Altan Tan, a deputy of the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, feels that the lack of information disclosed by the Turkish government is an attempt at a cover-up. The investigation so far has not been able to identify the 2 bombers or their affiliation. However, the Associated Press reports that 2 Twitter users who alluded to the bombings the day before the attack in tweets were arrested on Wednesday. Many Turkish citizens, such as Ali San, still remain hopeful for the future of Turkey.
We'll be stronger than ever for our demands for peace. We will honor the memory of our dead family and friends and insist on peace. There is no other way. Turkey cannot survive these horrors for long.
Turkey's government denies that the attack bears any connection to the upcoming elections and plans for the election to proceed as scheduled. This is Emily Livaday for the Global Current.
Next, Liam Scollins reports on South Africa's threat to leave the International Criminal Court.
Reuters reports that the ruling political party in South Africa, the African National Congress, announced on October 11th its plan to withdraw South Africa from the International Criminal Court. Sustained criticism of the South African government's decision to allow Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir free passage through the country has prompted the ANC's decision to break away from the ICC, which has a warrant for al-Bashir's arrest. According to a press release from the ICC, President al-Bashir is responsible for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes in the Darfur region of Sudan. The Darfur conflict began in 2003 and still lingers today. Nearly 3 million residents in Darfur have been displaced, and roughly 500,000 civilians have been killed in the conflict. In an interview with The Guardian, the ANC's chairman of the Commission on International Relations, Obed Bapella, stated that the ICC has lost its direction and maintained that the South African government has the right to allow President al-Bashir to enter and leave the country. Although the ANC holds the majority of seats in the South African Congress, over 60%, the government has not officially withdrawn from the ICC. In order to formally retract its membership from the ICC, Congress must debate and pass a majority resolution. Despite the ANC's large majority in Congress, many government officials hold President Bashir in contempt, and according to the BBC, several officials have stated that they believe al-Bashir is guilty of war crimes. While speaking to CCTV News, South African President Jacob Zuma asserted that as a democratic and sovereign nation, South Africa possesses the right to lead the ICC.
We are a democratic country, a democratic party in a democratic country. Democracy means there is competition, means that people have got free choices. They can point at anyone to say, this we think is better, the other one might have a different view, is allowed. I don't know why people get scared when people are saying we think so-and-so is better than so-and-so as part of a democratic culture.
President Zuma, whose support is a condition for a majority resolution to pass, will likely support the ANC in the legislature. Despite some internal opposition to the move, the ANC's vast congressional support and presidential backing is likely to cause a South African split from the International Criminal Court. This is Liam Scollins for the Global Current.
Morgan Mount shares the detail from this week's Nobel Prize in Economics award.
The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences has today decided to award the Sveriges Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel to Angus Deaton for his analysis of consumption, poverty, and welfare.
On October 12, 2015, Angus Deaton of Princeton University won the 2015 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. Born in Scotland during 1945, Deaton earned his PhD in economics at Cambridge. Deaton's work on consumption theory and inequality attained wide recognition. According to the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, Deaton won the award for his analysis of consumption, poverty, and welfare. His findings are revolutionary for the study of economics. Deaton explored how consumers distribute spending among different goods, how much income society saves and spends, and how welfare and poverty can be analyzed. The Economist explains that Deaton's research led to the development of the almost ideal demand system, a way of assessing how the demand for each good is dependent on the prices of all goods and on individual income. The model is now standard in scholarship and practical policy evaluation. Deaton's renowned consumption theory pioneers the microeconomic revolution in the study of consumption and saving over time. His theory reveals why the analysis of individual data is vital to understanding patterns in accumulative data. Deaton concentrates on developed countries to further understanding of poverty through household surveys that apply economic theory to experimentation. The Nobel Committee believes that Deaton's research on welfare has significantly influenced both practical policymaking and the scientific community. This is Morgan Mount for the Global Current.
Connor Briza analyzes recent development in the ongoing Syrian civil war.
The civil war in Syria took a turn in favor of the Assad government's forces as Russian troops and airstrikes began to take their toll on rebel forces and the Islamic State. Up until recently, rebel forces had been gaining ground in government-held territory. It is likely due to these gains and successes by the U.S.-backed rebels that the Russian military felt prompted to take action. According to the BBC, on October 11th, over 60 airstrikes were carried out by the Russian Air Force against rebel forces, with notable gains from the Syrian governments being observed in the provinces of Idlib, Hama, and Latakia. Precision strikes such as these are an integral part of the Russian plan and seem to be effective thus far against their targets. Russian involvement in the region certainly makes things more complicated for the United States, who up until this point has been trying actively to topple the Assad regime. U.S. airstrikes are now trickier, as any improper strike could cause an international incident should it strike Russian forces. In an interview with the Associated Press, Senator Angus King of the Intelligence and Armed Services Committee was quoted as saying, "Further air involvement has become very problematic because of the Russian engagement. Even more problematic for the U.S. efforts is that Russian forces offer legitimate opposition to the illegitimately supported rebel militaries, thus making most of the U.S.'s already dubious efforts to back the rebels essentially fruitless." Although Russia claims to be primarily interested in striking the Islamic State, a good portion of their strikes have hit rebel targets. On most fronts facing Assad's forces, they are often combating both the rebel militants and the Islamic State, which essentially opens up two significant targets for Russian bombardment. According to Reuters, this is the case in the city of Aleppo, where the government forces have been making steady gains over the past few weeks, while fighting both rebel forces and Islamic State forces. Russian airstrikes, alongside Iranian military units, have been crucial to Assad's success in these previously rebel-held territories. In the short term, Russian involvement will pave the way for Assad's military to reclaim lost territories and industrial regions. Airstrikes will be very important to the government forces as it offers them an edge, especially with U.S. military assets relatively in check for the time being. Russian ground forces offer many advantages, most notably in training, as well as deterring U.S. airstrikes. In the long term, Russian involvement will add legitimacy to the Assad regime, which faces broad international condemnation for its actions during the civil war. Russia also benefits from its relationship with Assad, and Putin has spoken at length about his support to the Syrian government. If Assad were to be overthrown, it is highly unlikely that his regime that would follow would be Russian-friendly, considering the covert involvement by the countries like the United States and Saudi Arabia. It also appears Russia is trying to demonstrate a sense of moral high ground, with Putin often citing the U.S. failures in the region as well as the growing threat of the Islamic State, reports the Wall Street Journal. President Putin emphasized these points in his address to the UN General Assembly earlier this month.
Today, we provide military and technical assistance both to Iraq and Syria and many other countries of the region who are fighting terrorist groups. We think it is an enormous mistake to refuse to cooperate with the Syrian government and its armed forces, who are valiantly fighting terrorism face to face. We should finally acknowledge that no one but President Assad's armed forces and Kurds militia are truly fighting the Islamic State and other terrorist organizations in Syria.
Overall, it would seem that with Russian assistance secured and the United States' involvement at a minimal, Assad's military should make some significant gains in the coming weeks and months. Depending on the level of support the rebels continue to receive, the incoming clashes could be very bloody, and with the civilian death toll already high, it can only be hoped that some stability return to the country. However, at this point, it is difficult to say whether or not Syria would be better off with or without Assad. This is Connor Breza for the Global Current.
Up next, Troy Travato discusses the rise of far-right political parties in the European Union.
On the 12th of February, 2015, 21 Coptic Orthodox Christians were kidnapped in Sirte, Libya, in retribution for an alleged kidnapping of a Muslim woman by the Coptic Church in Egypt. Subsequently, the Islamic State published a video of these 21 individuals being beheaded on the shores of Libya. In the video, it was announced that we will conquer Rome by Allah's permission. Russia Today reports that in April, self-identified Islamic State supporters uploaded images onto the social media platform, Twitter, of cities within Italy captioned with claims that we are among you and are waiting for the 0 hour. While these tweets were viewed as outlandish and with ridicule among the Italian population, the Daily Beast states that Matteo Renzi, the Prime Minister of Italy, considered military action and then later increased anti-terrorism presence to oversee heritage sites in Rome. To further complicate the instability within the Arab world, Libya, along with Syria and Iraq, have been increasingly affected by a rise of Islamist factions competing for control of the states. It would be naive to assume that the refugees seeking asylum in Europe have left the sectarian and religiously oriented conflict behind. On the 16th of April, Italian authorities confirmed that they had arrested Muslim refugees who had thrown 12 Christians overboard en route to Syria, according to CNN. In September, German law enforcement officials deemed it would be appropriate that the asylum shelters be segregated, with separate facilities for Christians and Muslims, notes the Telegraph. This was in response to 2 separate instances where fighting has occurred between the two demographics. Within the halls of power of the European Union, policymakers and politicians are attempting to understand how to move forward with processing the migrants which have landed on its shores from the Levant and Libya. Angela Merkel, current Chancellor of Germany, and French President François Hollande are some of the most outspoken advocates of the current European plan on refugees. This plan has been criticized by many far-right political parties, especially for the vague nature of the language in the document. According to critics, there is a lack of discernment on Europe's part in who is being admitted, affording the rights to asylum to those escaping any hardship, including poverty, as well as lack of follow-up about the lives of those who have been admitted. Nigel Farage, a British member of the European Parliament and member of the United Kingdom Independence Party, said in a recent speech,
"But there is a real and genuine threat. When ISIS say they want to flood our continent with 500,000 Islamic extremists, they mean it. And there is nothing in this document that will stop those people from coming. Indeed, I fear we face a direct threat to our civilization if we allow large numbers of people from that war-torn region into Europe."
In fact, these parties most critical have seen significant growth in their constituencies. Sweden, for example, known as one of the most progressive of European member states, has seen their Eurosceptic far-right party, the Swedish Democrats, rise to the third largest party in the recent general elections. So too, in Hungary, the ruling party Fidesz has taken a controversial opinion on the influx of refugees from the Islamic world. The current Prime Minister and leader of Fidesz, Viktor Orbán, in a recent press conference at the European Council, reminded heads of state of Hungary's collective memory under Islamic Ottoman control, which continues to color some attitudes within the Central European state.
I have to say that when it comes to living together with Muslim communities, we are the only ones who have experience because we had the possibility to go through that experience for 150 years in history. Some parts of Slovakia might be also affected by it, but not others. Polish people, for example, suffered from Christian people, not to name names. So we all have different experiences and therefore different reflexes.
It would be intellectually convenient to explain away the rise of the far right in Europe, painting them as xenophobes to be ignored and ridiculed. However, as they have grown enough through democratic processes to disrupt the traditional balance of power within national parliaments in nearly every member state within the European Union, from the United Kingdom to Hungary, Finland to France, the concerns they express must be understood as valid and rational to a large number of citizens. As of now, European authorities have no capacity to know who is crossing into their borders, trusting they all seek and fit the narrative of persecuted minorities and refugees on good faith. There may be legitimate unease reflected in what the far-right members of the European and various national parliaments have to say, one which cannot be ignored as being inconvenient, politically incorrect, or xenophobic because of face value assumptions. Reporting for the Global Current, this is Troy Travato.
Finally, this morning, Joshua Siegel brings you a lecture by Dr. Vishnu Wanjuno of the University of Indonesia, held this Thursday at Seton Hall School of Diplomacy.
With corruption costing Indonesia nearly $561 million last year, according to Indonesia Corruption Watch, and concerns over the continuation of anti-corruption policies within the country, this week's lecture by Dr. Vishnu Juwano provided increasingly crucial understanding of the internal politics of a vital partner in Southeast Asia. Dr. Juwano began his lecture by examining the history of international efforts to study and understand the deleterious effects of corruption. His evaluation covered the paucity of early corruption research and the previously held consensus that it promoted and contributed to efficiency. He then shifted his discourse to more recent scholarship, predominantly concentrated on the corrosive effect corruption has on investment enthusiasm and governmental legitimacy. Juwano elaborated on a number of famous studies. His examination of the research can be heard here.
As Anne-Marie suggested, I want to start it with the literature debate on the corruption. Most of the literature that I find, especially before the end of Cold War, is rarely mentioned about corruption as a development issue. Even the well-known Joseph Nye thinks that corruption contributes to the solution of economic development, national integrity, and government capacity at the time. And there's another perhaps, I don't know, my perception is because at the time there's a growing number of dictatorship from developing countries, especially from Chile, from Indonesia, Suharto, and from Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew. So I think at that time, most of the political observers think that they put the high economic growth, one of them is through the use, not the use, I mean. So there's a corruption, of course, there's a case of corruption, but that's okay as long as the economic growth is quite significant. At the time, Indonesia is seen as a tiger of Asia, yeah, because economic growth reached over 6% since 1960s until late 1990s. So before China became a big thing, actually there's a tiger Asia, which is one of them are Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia at the time, I think. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, the academic discourse became more critical on corruption. For instance, the Kaufman from World Bank showed that the bribe did not create bureaucratic efficiency, because one of the justification before that was that at least the corruption in the bureaucracy will help in terms of efficiency. But based on the quantitative research by Kaufman, it shows that actually it did not, according to Daniel Kaufman. Gupta et al. Shows that, in fact, corruption is lowering the quality of health and education services. But then, because of the fall of Soviet Union, democracy, accountability, freedom of speech become the hallmark issues, global issues. Corruption started to emerge as one of the top development issues.
Juwano shifted his dialogue away from the generalized effects of corruption, focusing in on Indonesia's unique history of corruption. He began with early colonial rule and perceptions of cultural factors before moving on to the government efforts to abuse power. His exploration of institutionalized theft under the Suharto administration elucidated the extent of exploitation within the Indonesian bureaucracy. Juwano briefly explained the scale and nature of the Indonesian graft.
The highlight is the Time magazine article in 1999 after the fall of Suharto, which uncovered that Suharto and family had amassed around 15 billion during the 3 decades of his presidency. Of course, the well-known Yusuf Wanandi, who used to support Suharto in early decades, he blamed that the growing up of Suharto's children, because Suharto's children own a lot of companies, even most of his children are become the top 20 richest Indonesians at the time. He owns many businesses like from toll road, shopping mall, even owned a Grand Hyatt Hotel and so on. And even the Global Corruption Barometer Index in 2004 crowned Suharto as the most corrupt political leaders in the world, with estimated embezzlement around 15 to 30 billion US dollars. But of course, Suharto doesn't accept this kind of assessment. He even sued the Time magazine and Time magazine especially about these accusations. And the family, most of the family is still active in politics. Even one of his Suharto daughter now is a member of parliament and one of the leadership in the second largest political party in parliament. So I guess this kind of revelation doesn't affect politically to the Suharto's family.
Following the establishment and contextualization of the illegal use of state funds and the decline of the Suharto administration, Juwono elaborated on the beginning of anti-corruption institutions in Indonesia, the rise of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, frequently called by his initials SBY, whose 10-year rule resulted in unprecedented reform initiatives. Juwono explained how SBY developed popularity among Indonesian voters through a career in public service, where he cultivated the image of a competent and incorruptible bureaucrat. Juwono elaborated further on SBY's commitment to proper governance.
But I will start with the SBY. Who is SBY? Who is Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono? Initially, he was known as an intellectual general who drive the initial phase of military reform since 1999. His military career ended during Gus Dur presidency, because at the time after Suharto's fall, there's a very dynamic political turbulence in which SBY was actually kicked upstairs to appointed as a Minister of Mining. He always, in every public occasion, he always mentioned that his obsession is wanted to be Chief of Army. He wants to revert to the Army and then become a Chief of Army, 4-star General Army. But somehow he got lost in political internal battle within the military, so he got kicked upstairs to become a Minister of Mining. But he skillfully used that positions to increase his political profile. And one of the important break is when he became promoted to become a coordinating Minister of Security during Gus Dur, in which he was tasked to lead the negotiation with the opposition in the parliament. Because Gus Dur at the time is quite erratic, unpredictable, and he make a lot of enemies in parliament. So Gus Dur charged SBY in negotiating with the parliament, political elites who was against Gus Dur. Because Gus Dur is quite a decisive figure, in the end, Gus Dur was eventually dismissed by the member of parliament. But before that, actually, SBY was fired by Gus Dur because SBY was refusing Gus Dur's request to dissolve the parliament at the time.
Dr. Juwono explained SBY's primary reform initiatives revolving primarily around the Corruption Eradication Commission, or KPK, and the promotion of technocrats to reform the standards of government agencies. The organization, as Juwano explained it, functions as an independent body responsible for conducting and carrying out investigations and also running court proceedings. Juwano explained the institutional framework of the KPK and anti-corruption courts.
It's not going to be easy because of this bureaucratic procedure and so on. It will take a long time. So, in the meantime, this KPK leadership, before getting a substantial resource from the government, they also depend on the donor support for partnership with the World Bank. When I was working in the World Bank, we also involved in terms of building the capability of the KPK at the time. I remember that the World Bank sent a number of KPK staff for training in Hong Kong in their investigation work for corruption cases. So this is a joint effort actually in institutional building. And finally, in 2009, KPK got around 315 billion state budget allocation, around 30 US million, which is quite substantial. And before KPK become effective, of course, institutional building of KPK will take time.
His presentation proceeded to assess the impact of these reform initiatives, including resistance from elements within the government, police, Indonesian oligarchs, and military's vested interests, as well as patronage, compelled many to vehemently oppose the measure. KPK was initially presented as an underfunded and largely marginalized initiative, almost exclusively reliant on outside donations. Despite the initial difficulties in institution building, KPK was revealed to be an effective and impartial body, which did in fact develop efficiency and prosecutorial powers. Indonesian society actively defended their interests, and SBY prevented interference with their investigations. The organization tried high-level state officials and began to challenge the police force. Juwano explored their success in pursuing upper echelons of political society and their consistently high levels of support. Juwano concluded his lecture expressing admiration for KPK's efforts while elucidating persistent and chronic financial as well as physical weaknesses, including manpower. He also expressed caution over the future of anti-corruption efforts and their vulnerability to political interference, referencing efforts by the police to disrupt investigative practices. He also referenced the necessity of political will and the potential for future political opponents to dismantle or impede efforts at future reform, as well as the limitations of institutions.
So the key is, ideally, of course, it would be ideal to KPK to doing all the work, but the KPK itself is to build an institution, it takes time. I mean, even that they, as I mentioned, the very successful cases that they prosecuted, is still minuscule compared to a lot of corruption cases what are happening around Indonesian political elites. For instance, like KPK, I'll give you a perspective. KPK is only like have 1,000 staff right now in 2014, while the Attorney General Office has 30,000. The police has 200,000 staff. So this is like a big difference. But of course, the media loves KPK because they created a sensational story, especially when they prosecuted high-profile cases. But actually, it's quite vulnerable. So what really depends by the KPK is the president's political support, because the president who has an authority to stop, for instance, as mentioned in the previous cases, if there's an attack by the police and so on. So I think, yeah, it's quite depressing. But
I hope you found this lecture informative. For The Global Current, I'm Joshua Siegel.
Tuning into this week's episode of The Global Current. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. I'm Elaine Du.
And I'm Joshua Siegel.
We'll see you next week.
The Global Current is brought to you by the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. Our executive producer is Alicia Sharavalli. Our associate producer is Bill Kolba. Our news editor is John Chateau, and our analysis editor is Blythe Brady. The Global Current theme song is Acid Jazz by Kevin MacLeod. You've been listening to The Global Current on 89.5 FM WSOU, Seton Hall's Pirate Radio.